Hi, everybody, and welcome back to an exciting and fun-filled essential new learning lecture with Doran. I'm sure you guys are just as enthralled as I am to sit here and talk about détente. And so that's what the purpose of this is going to be, is to basically give you kind of an overview of what's going on in the Cold War in Europe from basically 64 to 82, as you can kind of read on the screen at this time. This, as I said earlier in the note that I left online, is really going to take us only really kind of through what's going on in Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc and stuff like that. While my biggest regret of COVID-19 is not being able to see you guys and teach on a regular basis and get out of the house and get sunshine and air. Actually, there are lots of regrets. That list could go on for an extended period of time. One thing that you could say I'm mildly bent up over, mildly teeny upset about, is the fact that I don't get to teach you guys anything about like Western Europe during this time. There's just not time, and I know that you guys really were just incredibly excited to study the ins and outs of Thatcherism and Margaret Thatcher and the coal miners' strike of '80. I'm kidding, we wouldn't have done that, but unfortunately, we don't even get to go to interesting things like how Germany's win in the 1954 World Cup led to the economic miracle that launched them into like the third largest economy of the world, stuff like that. Anyway, so, as I said, this is mainly going to stick with like stuff in Eastern Europe. I'll stop digressing now. What you're looking at on the front here is the two people that were really kind of instrumental during this time, right, in the late 60s, early 70s. On the left would be Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, and on the right would be U.S. President Richard Nixon, who's elected in 68, elected again in 72, and then resigns amongst the Watergate scandal in 74. Also, while you're looking at an old copy of Time magazine, don't miss the, quote, new string bikinis down at the bottom. I've always found that to be a fascinating little old piece of like what pop culture used to look like. Hopefully you enjoyed that fascinatingly awesome transition. I don't know why I'm in a really sarcastic mood, but I'll try to, tone it down throughout the course of this as we go on. Anyway, back to this. Essentially, what I'm going to be arguing to you guys is that that basically the U.S. and the USSR realized that the Cold War was having an unnecessarily heavily influence on their economies. They were doing a number of things, spending tons of money on nukes. They'd gotten to the point they could blow the world up over multiple times, et cetera, et cetera. And it really was starting to hurt them economically. And this is going to be a big linchpin because if you don't know this, spoiler alert for those of you that want to go 2 weeks in advance here. The U.S. is going to win the Cold War by basically bankrupting and economically defeating the USSR. That's going to be the big thing here, right? To win the thing. And so what happens though in the late 60s is that both of their economies are not doing very well. Both are mired in social issues, some proxy wars, stuff like that, and they kind of agree to something called détente, or an easing of tensions. The problem is this: is that while both sides like the spirit of détente, they secretly didn't agree to all the treaties. They didn't limit arms the way they said they would, stuff along those lines. Both sides were way more concerned about like actually losing hegemony or power. And the minute that they started to actually lose that, they retreated from détente. And so it was just like a spirit of the word. This was not an actual hardcore easings of tensions, right? Nobody was willing to quite make that like play yet. And the result was that when it became politically and economically expedient, both sides abandoned détente in favor of renewed tensions and a revived Cold War, the Cold War of like the late 70s and the early 80s. And as we've told you guys in class multiple times before, like this is the world that Matheny and I were born into, the like Cold War of like and the world of like USA good, USSR bad, and like every pop culture, every textbook, every movie, every song. I mean, even like I was even looking back at like the Neil Young like "Rockin' in the Free World," right? Like rock and roll song based on that, et cetera, right? Like was based in and around that idea in the 70s and 80s, and that's really as a result of like the abandonment of détente. Okay, now, to get us to Brezhnev and détente and stuff like that, we first have to really quickly talk about the demise of this dude, Nikita or Nikki Khrushchev, as he was known as. Lots of great stories about Nikita Khrushchev. My personal favorite was that Stalin used to have these parties where he would basically force Khrushchev and Molotov and a few others to basically like drink like Leverente Beria like just heavily like into the night to like 3 or 4 in the morning, right? And Khrushchev would come home just absolutely smashed, and he would actually stay up with his wife, and they would sit there while he was still drunk and make a list of things that Stalin laughed at and enjoyed, and that Stalin didn't laugh at and didn't enjoy, and then they'd go back over it the next day so that they could like pander to Stalin appropriately. So, as you guys saw in in the textbook reading about the Berlin Wall stuff in the 50s after Stalin's death, and then into kind of de-Stalinization. Khrushchev had taken control of the Soviet Union after getting rid of a few people and stuff like that, but he'd never been overly popular, especially because from some of the hardliners with the de-Stalinization and stuff like that. They didn't think he handled the crisis in Germany or Poland in '53 that you watched on the video about to begin with very well. And then he handled the crisis with Imre Nagy even worse. And then he botched the Cuban Missile Crisis. And by '64, with no real new injection of cash, having dropped tons of money on Cuba, with the fact that the Sino-Soviet split's going on, so China, despite coming communist, is not on the side of the USSR, and the two are really kind of hating each other, etc., etc. There's this general feeling inside the Politburo that Soviet power is waning, and so when Nikita Khrushchev goes on vacation in the Black Sea in October of '64, the leaders of the Soviet Union basically hold kind of a little bit of an internal coup, and Leonid Brezhnev begins conspiring with members, and they take control. And this happens to Khrushchev. This happens while Khrushchev is on vacation. And when he gets back, they basically say "Hey, look, you can go into retirement and call it, and we'll give you a nice little apartment in Moscow, or we can have an actual coup and a trial and accuse you of a bunch of things and execute you and stuff like that." Khrushchev makes a great quote. I love this. He says, "I'm old and tired. Let them cope by themselves. I've done the main thing. Could anyone have dreamed of telling Stalin that he didn't suit us anymore and suggesting he retire? Not even a wet spot would have remained where he had been standing. Now everything is different. The fear is gone, and we can talk as equals. That's my contribution. I won't put up a fight." Okay, and Nikita Khrushchev goes into retirement, and starting in 1964, Leonid Brezhnev takes power, and he will remain General Secretary of the Communist Party in Soviet Union until 1982. Okay, so there he is in all his radiant glory, Leonid Brezhnev. Widely considered an idiot both inside the Soviet Union and outside of the Soviet Union. A number of people, though, it's never been written and proven concretely, have speculated that he was actually put in charge because he was a patsy, and the other members of the Politburo knew that they would be able to control him. He's famous internally for having given himself the award Hero of the Soviet Union twice, having written a book that he made it very clear that he'd never actually written or read after it came out and was published under his name, one of which he won those medals for, etc., etc. And while I have, as I said, a number of disappointments involving COVID, another one of those is the fact that I don't just get to tell you random communist jokes that popped up from time to time. So I'll try to incorporate a few on here. I've got my best that I'll save for the very end. But my favorite Brezhnev one involved the Man on the Moon in '68, and this circulated in the U.S. For a while, or sorry, '69, and somebody comes in and says, Comrade Brezhnev, the Americans have landed a man on the moon," and Brezhnev says, don't worry, it's okay, we're going to outdo them. We're going to land a man on the sun. But, comrade, if we do that, I think they'll burn up. Don't worry, we're going to do it at night. So, with that in mind, let's talk about the Eastern Bloc under Leonid Brezhnev. Okay, by far the most important protest movement that's going to occur anytime, even under Stalin, etc., until we get to Solidarity in the 1980s, is going to be something called Prague Spring, which occurs in 1968. And if you guys remember Arab Spring from about 10 years or so ago, that is what we're talking about, or that's what it's referencing when it was called Arab Spring, is it's referencing Prague Spring in 1968. Now, before we get to this, I should note that it's really almost kind of comical that Prague's even kind of behind the Iron Curtain. I mean, this is a city that has very, very close ties to Western Europe, super close ties to Germany, is geographically physically literally further west than Vienna, which is not behind the Iron Curtain, and it's literally just a coincidence of history and the fact that the Soviets really wanted to get back at the ethnic Germans and the whole Sudetenland thing and stuff like that they'd left the Red Army there and occupied it, and Czechoslovakia had become communist. Okay, but there was never much of an appetite for it. In the same way that, like, while you can argue about the different appetites for communism throughout other parts of the Eastern Bloc, three countries make it incredibly clear: Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, that there is like no appetite for communism throughout the course of the time that they are under communist rule. And what happens is in 1968, a dude by the name of Alexander Dubček is elected first secretary of the Communist Party, and he promises a number of reforms. Okay, his famous line, as I show you in a second, is that we'll have to remove everything that strangles artistic and scientific creativeness. Okay, so basically, he wanted to like liberalize, have more freedom, have changes, etc., etc. Okay, um, and Dubček began promising this, and as he's doing this, a number of students get behind this, and they begin to occupy parts of central Prague. Okay, and basically on a daily basis, from like January through to August, there's student occupies and student occupations and student movements and stuff like that. Dubček is actually the students' biggest ally. He delivers speeches in February promising change. By April, he's done things that have said like, hey, let's phase in like this free speech plan by May. Let's do this like economic competition and free enterprise plan by June, blah, 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 blah. And really calling for a number of reforms and stuff like that. And he's actually supported by the students who are led by a dude who makes himself very well known with his voice of on-air narration and guidance on the radio station the students have at the time, known as Radio Free Czechoslovakia. And this is a dude by the name of Václav Havel. We'll talk lots more about him later. He'll eventually become president of Czechoslovakia. As this happens, there's a really kind of mixed reaction from the Warsaw Pact and the Eastern Bloc members of it. Some of them have a big issue with it. Hungary is cool with it. Hungary had been under the system where basically they allowed this weird system called Kadarism, where they allowed like the top intellectuals to speak against the government, but other people weren't allowed to. So like Hungary saw this as a natural kind of like easing, but eventually the hardliners in the Warsaw Pact go the other way, and they start to see this as a major problem. I won't leave it on here for too long in case you want it. If you want to, you can pause it to look at it longer. But on the top left is Dubček right there. And then the other three pictures are pictures of student protests during this time. You can see the famous kind of picture that almost harkens back to the photo you've probably seen of Tiananmen Square before and stuff like that, of the dude in front of a tank. You can see the students protesting in Wenceslas Square in Prague, in Newtown, Prague right there. On the bottom right, just kind of in sit-ins. And then you can see the tanks begin to move in, because if you hadn't figured this out, the Warsaw Pact is going to send in tanks to crush this movement here. And the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union are going to crush this movement under the pretense of something that you should be aware of that'll definitely come up in the next 2 years multiple times, called the Brezhnev Doctrine. Okay, and the Brezhnev Doctrine argues this. Okay, and we're going to read what he calls socialism as communism. Okay, I'm even going to say communism. Okay, so what it argues is this: is that when forces that are hostile to communism try to turn the development of some communist country towards capitalism, it becomes not only the problem of the country concerned, but the problem of all communist countries going, basically, right? The concern of all communist countries, okay? And so what that basically says is it gives them carte blanche to interfere and invade and keep anything and anybody that might try to turn away from the Soviet bloc, from the Warsaw Pact, from the Iron Curtain, whatever you want to call it, by saying that, if you follow, Marx's theory of permanent revolution and Stalin and Trotsky's, ideas about socialism in one country, then we need to, it's actually more Trotsky's that Stalin stole, as we know, then we need to spread the revolution and keep the revolution going. And so in order to do this, it is the concern of all communist countries if one group tries to turn one country towards capitalism. Okay. By August 20th of 1968, the Warsaw Pact cites the newly minted Brezhnev Doctrine, and the tanks roll in. Nothing that they hadn't done before in stuff like Hungary in 56 and stuff like that. But they've now got, the Brezhnev Doctrine behind it, so it's that much more acceptable. It's mainly just the Red Army. They gather a few random troops from, Poland or Romania or places like that, so they can be like, see, look, it's the whole Warsaw Pact. But to be honest, it's really just the Red Army for the most part. In order to avoid a repeat of Hungary in '56, and the promises that like people were going to come to the aid of the rebellion and stuff along those lines. In order to avoid that, Havel, Dubček, and others get on the radio and they tell the students not to resist, to stand down, and to avoid bloodshed. And for the most part, bloodshed is avoided. It's a few hundred the people that I think are killed. A lot of the other ones like Havel are round up and arrested and stuff like that. He'll remake himself in the bit. As a matter of fact, Dubček is actually summoned to Moscow, and in a situation very similar to the video that I hoped you watched from earlier this week, where they were talking about Gomulka in Poland in '53, and they said, the Soviets have decided you're sick, and Gomulka says, well, I don't feel sick, and they said, well, but what you don't understand is that sickness is not a matter of health; it's a matter of politics. Dubček is declared sick in the same way, and he is replaced with Gustav Husak, who basically comes into Czechoslovakia and reverses all reforms. Okay, reverses all reforms. As I said, Havel and other members of the group, Dubček kind of goes into retirement. He'll be involved a little bit, nowhere near as much as Havel, in like the full revolution that brings Czechoslovakia back to a democratic state, and then what eventually leads to the split between Czech Republic and Slovakia. Okay. But Havel and others are going to regroup and continue their nonviolent dissent. They're going to rename their group something called the Civic Forum. Okay, we'll talk a lot more about them later. But that's their logo, which I think is one of the coolest logos ever. Down below, the word for civic in Czech begins with an O, so you just put a smile in it and it works out fairly well. And they're going to do and promote tons of nonviolent dissent. We're going to talk about this a lot tomorrow or so in reading and then on the message board on Turnitin and stuff like that. Havel does this. He's a playwright through a number of different plays and stuff along those lines, most famously the Memorandum, and they invent this type of thing called samizdat, which basically is where you kind of smuggle pieces of like literature or arguments or stuff like that out of Eastern Europe so it can be disseminated to the West and to other intellectuals in Eastern Europe and stuff like that. Most importantly, though, Václav Havel, as we'll talk about, now I'll talk about the Charter 77 manifesto and stuff like that. Let me just show you some pictures I've been. As you may or may not have found out if you've ever looked around my office, Václav Havel is my favorite person in European history. I absolutely love the guy. I think his arguments on well, I love the fact that he's not only a playwright and an artist and stuff like that. I think his arguments on power, who has it, who uses it, how it's used, especially in a post-totalitarian society, are fascinating. I think the fact that like he continued like peaceful protest despite like his backstory and kind of being put down by the Czechs are fascinating. And on top of that, I love the fact that he loves like 1970s rock. I mean, here's a guy who absolutely worshipped the Velvet Underground. There he is sitting there right there with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and the Rolling Stones. Just kind of completely, just being cool, I guess, for lack of a better word, because if you're in the presence of the Rolling Stones, I think you're generally cool. Either way, they got actually to be good enough friends. Matheny and I have mentioned this before, that the Rolling Stones actually bought the lights outside Prague Castle as a gift to Václav Havel and for everything he'd done. But he also made a lot of very unpopular decisions when he was later president of Czechoslovakia, like apologizing for some of the things that had been done post-World War II to Czech Germans and stuff along those lines. What happened in this time was there was this protest band, okay? And I know like very few of you really kind of care about this, but I think from talking to you, I think I might be able to pique like Alejandro or somebody like that's interest here in this, called the Plastic People of the Universe, okay? And protest bands are actually like fairly important. Excuse the name on this, but there's a fairly famous one in Russia right now known as Pussy Riot that keeps having like getting arrested and having issues and uses protests to bring up Putin and stuff along those lines. And this was the Plastic People of the Universe. And the Plastic People of the Universe are arrested. And when they are arrested, Havel pins something called the Charter 77 Manifesto. And in that, and this is what you're going to read for tomorrow, is a segment called The Power of the Powerless. And this deals with like what it is that people who have no power can actually do in this type of situation. Okay, and I want you guys to check that out for tomorrow, and then I have a few things that we can have a discussion for in class. I'm trying to kind of do this, recreate some of the discussion part of class and the interesting part rather than just like me just giving you all the information. So check that out tonight. Keep in mind Doran loves Václav Havel. Keep that in mind anytime. This is just like kind of in life's reference here, right? Anytime your teacher says, I love this, or when you get to college, your teacher says, hey, I wrote my doctoral thesis on this, that means write it down. It's going to be on a test. Oh, and just for 20 seconds of your viewing pleasure, there is Covey at about age 8 months, sitting there wearing a onesie that says Vaclav Havel rules that Matheny had bought him slash me as a you just had a kid present. That's all. Okay, for the last 10 minutes or so, and again, feel free to play me at like 1.5 speed if me going over into, the 28, 29-minute mark offends your 25-minute sensibilities during essential new learning. But for these last 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about Nixon and détente and kind of the impact and fallout of that here. This easings of tensions occurs for basically the entire decade of the 1970s, okay? And it's begun under Richard Nixon, who is generally considered to be a domestic policy disaster, see Watergate, et cetera, and a foreign policy genius, see China, et cetera. And this is partially due to his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger is obsessed with Bismarck, Metternich, Realpolitik, and its use in European history. And so he thinks that whatever he can do to make things move around and work and happen are really big. And he's actually willing to engage with the Soviets on a way that like other people would not. And that's why I bring up the Realpolitik and stuff like that. Um, Meanwhile, at the same time, the USSR's economy is stagnating in the late 60s. It's trying to keep pace with the US on nukes. Okay. The space race is not helping either. The USSR had gotten somebody into space first and stuff along those lines, but then the US had made putting a man on the moon the priority, and we'd done it in 1969, which had regained American pride, soft power, et cetera, but only made the USSR want to, like, further spend more money on the space race, which was one of the few things they really kind of thought they were winning. Meanwhile, the United States is very heavily mired in Vietnam, which the USSR wants to exploit. Long story short, both sides could use some cash, and with mutually assured destruction theory, remember that idea that like both sides could kill each other, so neither side will, right? And the fact they could blow up the world several times over at this point, there's really not a whole lot to be gained for more nukes, okay? So they enter into something called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, okay? Which is supposed to freeze nukes, okay? Whether it does or not is debatable, but we'll look at graphs and talk about the importance of that in a bit. The other thing that happens during this time is that in August of 75, they meet again to sign something called the Helsinki Accords, which is a really cute idea that says, hey, we should improve relations between the East and West, but that's all it really says. It doesn't actually do anything with that. But let's talk about and look at this nukes thing for a second here. Before we get to the nukes, by the way, that's Richard Nixon right there. Um, his kind of, yes, Nixon-y face. And then Henry Kissinger, his Secretary of State down below. If you've never heard Kissinger speak, you really should YouTube him for 20 seconds. He has a voice that sounds like a tuba. It's absolutely incredible. Okay, so here's the nukes part, though, right? Um, as Winston Churchill said, very famously, at a certain point, all you're going to do is make the rubble bounce. Okay, I mean, look at this. By 1975, like the USA is claiming to have 25,000 nukes. The USSR 25,000 nukes. The US's is going down some. The USSR's is going up, and that's part of the problem right there. Is the USSR is going to think that the United States is not abiding to SALT, and instead of like using it to actually scale back, they're going to, as you can see, right in 1975, use it as an excuse to subtly increase their arsenal and peak at something along the lines of 40,000 nukes. And to be honest, guys, again, at a certain point, all you're going to do is make the rubble bounce. But to be honest, most people think that these numbers are low. Most experts would argue these numbers are low. And so, like, SALT really kind of sends, like, the Soviet Union into kind of like a nuke tailspin. It doesn't do great things for us either, which will eventually lead to the bankrupting of the Soviet Union as you start to get to kind of cracks in the seams here. The other place that cracks in the seams occur, and it's very subtle to begin with, but it really gets at the idea of soft power, is actually the election of Pope John Paul II. Okay, 1978 is a weird year. It's the year of three popes. One pope dies, then another pope is elected and dies within a few months in office. That's John Paul I. And then John Paul II is finally elected pope. And he was never supposed to be pope. As a matter of fact, like, he didn't really pay any attention to his conclave. Nobody'd heard of him before. And halfway through conclave, somebody's like, hey, everybody likes this dude, Karl Wojtyla. And if we elected a Polish pope, that would be a direct front to the Eastern Bloc and really, really, really kind of piss off the Soviets for a number of reasons, including the fact that it would show power outside of them. When Poland, it would, galvanize the Polish people. But you've got that whole idea that, like, remember, Marx said religion is the opiate of the masses. So, like, communists and religion are supposed to be like diametrically opposed, and John Paul is going to use this and exploit that hardcore. And to a certain extent, the Catholic Church almost kind of knew that, like, that's the type of person they were getting into at this point. This is what makes him so popular, and he's now like Saint Pope John Paul II. I mean, we're talking about one of the most popular popes in all of papal history here. In 1979, he travels to Poland, okay? And he gets down and he kisses the ground at the Warsaw airport. And this quote is perfect. When Pope John Paul II kissed the ground at the Warsaw airport, he began the process by which communism in Poland and ultimately elsewhere in Europe would come to an end. Okay, there was no way to describe it. It's estimated that 1 in every 3 Poles saw him at the time on this journey, which is astronomically high, 1/3 of the population. It's actually what caused political scientist Joseph Nye to coin the term soft power. Because he was trying to figure out how to describe, like, the situation that John Paul II had, that he could kind of hold over this. And that was the best way to describe it was, well, if there's hard power, then this is soft power. And this is literally how we came up with the term soft power. It rejuvenated the Polish people, kind of got them out of the funk of the 70s, and kicked off this movement called Solidarity, which would be massively instrumental, maybe the biggest or the biggest since Prague Spring, in kind of easing and breaking up the Iron Curtain. Speaking of solidarity, and you can see Pope John Paul II down on the bottom left right there. There he is with a man by the name of Lech Walesa, who would be the leader of Solidarity. Solidarity is going to be a Polish trade union, and Lech Walesa and Solidarity are going to start the movement that brings down communism in Poland. Unfortunately, and this is a bummer, I usually try to bring in a guest speaker, and I had a great guest speaker for you guys who was involved in the Solidarity movement. But unfortunately, because of COVID, we weren't able to do it. Same type of thing, I usually have also tried to bring in a guest speaker, somebody who grew up in the Eastern Bloc, to talk about that. Another thing that we just weren't able to do, unfortunately, because of COVID. Sorry, guys. Okay, almost done here. Solidarity in Poland. And by the way, it looks like Walesa. As you can see, it's pronounced like Lech Walesa, okay? As I said, it's an anti-communist movement, and all he is an electrician, and it begins with a strike, okay? But strikes were illegal. Um, but then Walesa led a strike of 17,000 people, and so the Polish government kind of had to, like, release a little bit of, like, things and say, okay, strikes will be okay, and they have a Gdansk agreement, and they say, okay, we will give you better working conditions, and all of a sudden Walesa says, you know what, in that case we're unionizing. Okay, and Solidarity becomes, literally, it starts as a trade union. That's the name of it, Solidarity, the trade union Solidarity. Um, at its height, 1 in 3 Polish people is a member of Solidarity, which, much like the total number, so actually I flipped that then. I thought the number was going to say 1 in 4. It's, in that case, it's 1 in 4 people saw John Paul II come out to speak, and then 1 in 3 people were members of Solidarity. Okay. Which is, again, astronomically high, and it becomes more than just a trade union. It becomes an intellectual exchange. It becomes a movement where people are able to, political exchange and movement and stuff like that. For example, like, at one point, the Polish government threatens to arrest Lech Walesa and impose martial law. And John Paul II makes a statement where he says, if you send troops into Poland like you did to Hungary and Czech Republic and stuff like that, I will resign the papacy. I will go to Gdansk. I will go to the front lines, and I will have to be the first person that you shoot when you go to put down this rebellion. If that's not the epitome of soft power, I don't know what is. And if that's not the best way to make the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc look absolutely horrible and completely handcuff them, I don't know what is either. By 1983, Pope John Paul II is supporting Solidarity. The U.S. had been secretly funneling money since 81 or so. By 85, the U.S. and the U.K. are openly supporting Solidarity in Poland, and it has become a not-so-great secret that the Iron Curtain is in the process of starting to very, very, very slowly crumble. Meanwhile, despite the era of détente, everything is not great in the Cold War between the U.S. and this is the last thing we're going to talk about, by the way, between the U.S. And the Soviet Union here. Both sides have gotten themselves into two huge proxy wars, which are really, really, really sucking out the morale of their people, the politics, the money, etc., etc. For the United States, it's Vietnam, and that's literally all we're going to talk about Vietnam, because you'll do it like tons next year. And for the USSR, it's Afghanistan. And on top of that, both sides are funneling money to the opposite side. So, like, for example, we're doing all sorts of things to help the people who are battling the USSR. A number of those people are known as the Taliban. We don't know what they're going to do, but we know they don't like the Soviet Union, so we give them a bunch of money to battle the Soviet Union, etc., etc. That's going to bite us in the butt later, in case you missed that. But either way, the Soviet Union is doing the same thing to the Viet Cong in Vietnam, etc., etc. So that's why I said, like, while détente's on the surface, it's really not détente, okay? In 1980, the United States decides that it is going to protest the USSR's involvement in the Afghan war by boycotting the Summer Olympics in Moscow, and that is generally seen as the end of détente. Okay, the USSR responds by boycotting the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. So the arms races begin again, but as I've mentioned, and as it says, hashtag foreshadowing, the USSR can't afford to keep up. Okay, and we'll get to that in a bit later on in the unit or so. Brezhnev dies by 1982. Eventually, Brezhnev is succeeded by a man by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. And meanwhile, in 1980, the United States elects a new president by the name of Ronald Reagan. These two people right here, Gorbachev on the left and Reagan on the right, are going to be the people that are most considered instrumental in ending the Cold War, okay? And they will be the last big people involved in this thing. Now, I told you I'd leave you with a joke or so, okay? There are 5 big leaders of the USSR: Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and then Gorbachev right here. The story goes like this. Train breaks down, has all 5 leaders on it. All 5 leaders decide they're going to get the train going in the way they know best, okay? Lenin goes out there, he strikes for the workers, he calls for everything going, he roughs up a few people, he gets the train going that way. Stalin gets out there, shoots the entire work crew, goes back on the train. Khrushchev comes out, tries to revive the dead crew, gets the train going downhill, and then says, hey, everything works. When the train stops at the bottom, Brezhnev gets there, he sits in the middle of the train, closes all the shades, and rocks back and forth pretending if it's still moving. And then finally, Mikhail Gorbachev comes along, and he decides to protest the train, the rail, the movement, and everything around it. That's all, guys. Hope that you mildly got that and enjoyed it. Enjoy stuff for the rest of the week. We will look at the power of the powerless, and then after that, we'll move back to Latin America and spend some time on the Argentine Dirty Wars and Operation Condor and other things that went on then. Have a good one, everybody. Talk to y'all soon.